This is episode 249 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, well, we are back into full lockdown mode here in New Mexico. The governor, I was just waiting last week. Is she going to have a press conference on Thursday? And then finally, on Friday the 13th of all dates.
That's when it started the first time, I understand, too. Yeah. Several people pointed that out to me. So,
yeah. And we are back in lockdown mode. Now, every lockdown is different in New Mexico, at least. So a few nuances have been developed in the most recent lockdown policy. But, Wally, before we get too far into it, if this lockdown idea, the concept worked, wouldn't we be in a much better position with this virus than we were, we are now? Things have really gotten out of control since early October, and now we're worse than we've ever been. Yeah, things were a little bit more open before, but it just seems like the whole lockdown concept didn't work in the first place. And even though people are wearing masks, they're being very careful, blah, 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 we're right back in the soup.
Yes, absolutely, Paul. It's one of those that, yes, if masks were as effective as they said they were, and if social distancing and lockdowns were as effective, we wouldn't have been in this situation. There are those who say, "Oh, I saw somebody not wearing a mask." At least in public, I have seen incredibly high levels of compliance with masks and social distancing. I've not literally been anywhere in the past month in New Mexico where I felt like somebody was flaunting the rules and not doing what they had been asked to do. And then, as you point out, it has not been effective. And so we're going to do more of the same that wasn't effective. And, at what cost to our economy? And so, the whole thing was early on in this pandemic, the idea that you couldn't make trade-offs between COVID policy and any other policy. Well, that was not really a very worthy idea at that point, and now it's showing its really hugely ugly side in terms of health problems for people for non-COVID related things. The fact that school children are not able to go to school, and a huge learning deficit, a learning gap, something that'll never be made up. And yet, will it work this time? I hope it will. I hope it works tremendously well. But given past experience, the odds don't look real good for it.
Yeah, and just kind of as a refresher and kind of keeping perspective in mind, there's no doubt that the daily reported number of new cases is off the charts compared to where we were at any other time in this crisis. And that curve really started to go up at the beginning of October. The deaths in New Mexico have also risen, maybe not quite as dramatically as the cases, but certainly very dramatically as well. We were locked down more or less completely for, a couple months, basically from mid-March into mid-May or even into early June. And, there's been some opening that had happened until recently. And now we're back to being pretty fully locked down. And we're going to talk a lot about a few of the specifics on that. Restaurants being one of the ones that's been, again, at least for 2 weeks, totally locked down. And 2 weeks is what we're being told. We don't know when this is really coming to an end.
Yeah, and then after 2 weeks, the order, as I understand it, is on a county by county basis. If you meet the, yet unfully articulated regulations
Right.
and rules to open up. There might be some opening. The thing that gives me pause, that makes me think this will be certainly more than 2 weeks, is many of the other states that do things much like New Mexico has done had started out initially with a 3 week shutdown. And so that when I saw that, I was like, yeah, I sort of doubt if there's going to be a whole lot of opening. But again, what are those? What does the science and data tell us in 2 weeks? What do the numbers have to be? We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, and of course, hospital beds are a real issue. There's no doubt that that is something we want to avoid, a lack of hospital beds and medical professionals to staff those beds. So, you could reasonably say 2 weeks to flatten the curve, we really need to do this kind of thing, like was the rhetoric before, but that rhetoric never really panned out before. We never really reopened our economy. And after 9 months, 8 months, whatever, people just don't buy into what the political leadership is saying. And even if they say they do, and I hear this, people might think, oh, I'll bet you Paul Gessing never talks to anybody who's not a card carrying libertarian or Republican. Well, I actually talk to large numbers of people on the left side of the political spectrum, and uh, they, by and large, as I see them, feel similarly about a lot of the lockdown aspects. Unfortunately, from kind of the legislative November perspective, they don't always change their vote based on their views of what the governor is doing. That just because they think the governor's lockdown policy isn't working and it may be even flouted, they're not necessarily going to change their vote on that issue. And uh, yeah, so here we are, uh, and obviously we're in much more worse shape economically. The virus itself, there are some glimmers of hope, including a vaccine, but it's pretty challenging out there right now. And as we head into winter, there are further challenges and questions. Uh, but let's do some brief analysis here of the shutdown. So, Film has signed their own kind of separate working agreement with the governor. You can go onto the film office's website and read the contours of that. So they were not directly affected by the most recent order. They've got COVID safe practices allegedly, and that's good for them. Now, I don't. I wish that other businesses could come to the governor with a here we are going to comply with all of these various techniques for stopping the spread of the virus, and we pledge to work with you. Now, there's not many films being filmed in New Mexico, to my
Right.
knowledge, none, but it is interesting to note. Gyms are considered non essential, so all gyms are being shut down, which, as we head into the winter time with limited outdoor exercise opportunities, that makes life more difficult for folks to just stay in shape. And we know that a strong immune system can be helped by being in good shape physically outside of that. And real estate is not considered essential. So I saw a note from the
And it was the first time, wasn't
I
it?
know. And with the real estate situation booming like it is, one of the industries that right now is truly booming in New Mexico is people from more lockdown states or just places with higher cost of living and even higher taxes than New Mexico say, well, I can go be in the sun 300 days a year. The weather's pretty nice. I can get a house for much cheaper than here in California or New York or New Jersey or you name it, Illinois. But yeah, the New Mexico Association of Realtors has a note on their website, and I'd heard rumblings, and they're talking about the ways in which the real estate brokerages and realtors must close their physical office and work remotely. They minimize personal interaction with customers. It's just a very burdensome way. Anyone who's ever bought a house knows how much time you have to spend with a real estate agent. What those people do is clearly very personal, not to mention all the documents you got to sign
Yeah.
at the end of the process. It just strikes me as odd, especially given that was one of the industries that's been particularly healthy in the state, is people coming here to buy homes. And so golf courses, of course. Now we're getting,
The I drove by Los Altos Golf Course. I had to run an errand of a medical nature, mission of mercy.
oh,
So, for the record, it wasn't mine. I had to take someone something at a healthcare facility, and driving by Los Altos Golf Course, no flags on the greens, no golfers on the course. So,
and again, we've had 6 months of golf since it was shut down for about a month. To my knowledge, I haven't heard of a single case of COVID-19 being spread in a golf course. Of course, young people were prevented from playing their golf season this year, and we decried that, and it's just very questionable. But uh, it is just all over the place again. A lot of questions, hard to find answers. I think a great quote here, though, from Channel 13, the lady who owns Orange Theory. It's a fitness studio. She said, as a small business owner, kind of a gym kind of place. So, as a small business owner, we've worked so unbelievably hard to keep our studios open, disinfected, socially distanced. So, are we doing all the right things? The fitness industry takes COVID very, very seriously. And if you look at those rapid response watch tests, we're not on it. I don't care if you're a big box gym or a teeny tiny Orange Theory, we're not on it. And yet they are being shuttered. And again, there are health implications for people who lose their ability to go work out and stay fit outside of the home. And it, it just strikes me as, again, very arbitrary, very capricious, and really, uh, we may slow the spread for now, but people will get the virus again once they start going out. And I suspect that they're maybe going to be more secretive about their going out. Uh, I just can't imagine people, again, willingly, just on a large scale, staying inside for 2, 3, 4, 6 weeks or more during the holiday season with all the family stuff that people want to reconnect with those folks.
yes, I agree with you, and that's one of those. We have the two largest family holidays in our country coming up: Thanksgiving and Christmas. It'll be interesting to see. Um, uh, did I read it correctly? Where the groups of five or more counts at Thanksgiving. So if you have six people at Thanksgiving, uh, I guess you're breaking the law. That's going to be an interesting one. And then the other one, to follow up on what you said with the gyms, it's one of those things that, just speaking for myself personally, Paul, my initial month or 6 weeks of the March COVID was not good. I attained a record weight. I was pretty depressed. I'm like, this is crazy. I got to get out and exercise. But I'm just doing. I go walking, ride my bike places where people aren't. I do think that having an outlet uh, probably makes me a safer human being. More healthy, more able to fight off the virus should it happen, and because I'm able to do something outdoors that has some activity, some movement around, I'm not tempted to go to these evil gatherings of six or more people. So it's interesting that there all of the guidance to this part has been don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. I think we need a little bit of what should we do? What are the positives? What are some things that we ought to think about? Those have been really few and far between here in New Mexico. And when I've traveled to a couple of other states, that border New Mexico, they have been continue to be much more open. It's a totally different atmosphere. Just driving through the states, interacting in terms of how they're operating, and both of those states, one that's to the north of us, one's to the west, is doing actually better than New Mexico, at least recently.
Yeah, and kind of to put this in a more personal light, also, like you said, Wally, you know, my three kids, 10, 8, and 4. So my oldest just moved into point shoes for her ballet, which is something where you you move out of the little kitty slippers
Mm-hmm.
into something with like a wooden block in it, so that it
Mm-hmm.
helps you do that real tippy toe thing. Her dance studio is closed for a couple weeks, and you really can't do that kind of thing remotely. So you hope that it's just 2 weeks, but for people who are in those kind of sensitive skill building uh, exercises, whether it's somebody who's looking for a college basketball scholarship or gymnastics or whatever it might be, in this case, ballet. So they lose that time and she'll lose that time. My other daughter's in gymnastics. She does it not just because of her enjoyment of gymnastics, but she has a physical disability that requires some kind of physical therapy, athletic training. That gym is closed as well. And so she'll have to forego her physical training, and it involves one side of her body potentially weakening. And the longer she stays out of that physical class and that effort, she doesn't get to benefit from that. And my 4-year-old plays soccer, and while a bunch of 4-year-olds running around on a soccer field isn't necessarily life and death, those kids are particularly not not vulnerable to the coronavirus, and it's just unfortunate that someone at that age needs to go through this. Thankfully, while the older two are being homeschooled, and we're going to talk about education a little bit, the 4-year-old school has had maintained itself as open. They've spent untold quantities of money on PPEs and other things that strike me as dubious at best, but at least they have been able to serve the families and children that require some kind of preschool and need that kind of thing to happen. So, personally, it is challenging and just really hard to understand the logic of doing this yet again. But
Well,
speaking,
and
oh,
if I
go
could
ahead.
just follow
Sure,
on, just
sure.
one final thought is I don't want to in any way sound like I am complaining about my situation relative to people. I have friends and colleagues that have three kids, four kids. They have to watch them at home. That it's a very challenging situation. I know people who are unable to work because daycare is not available. And then back to the technology of New Mexico and distance learning and learning on Zoom. If you don't have a computer and you don't have an internet connection, you don't get to go to school. And what one of the you talked about physical skills. I just liken the mental skills. What can atrophy are reading, writing, arithmetic,
Oh yeah.
science, you know, uh, logic, critical thinking, music. That's all atrophying as well. And the data shows that the spread amongst that community sure looks, the kids sure seem like they're not getting it, or if they're getting it, they don't even know it. And so it's back to this one size fits all approach that we have in New Mexico.
No doubt about that. And yeah, this is, in looking at my show notes, this is pretty much an all COVID-19 episode, unfortunately. Uh, Speaking of which, the Albuquerque City Council was supposed to uh, consider mandatory paid sick leave this evening at City Council. That is pushed back by a week. Uh, and nothing's changed about this bill. It's just the schedule has changed. But the idea that you would enact a mandatory paid sick leave policy in the middle of this shutdown, when very, very many, nearly all of the businesses impacted by this mandatory sick leave policy will now have been shut down for a second time at tremendous cost to themselves and their employees. Now, we can talk about sick leave and the importance of it and whether it benefits certain workers or not, but the idea that Albuquerque City Council could take it upon itself next week, in the middle of this 2 week, 3 week, whatever week lockdown, to enact such a policy. I really hope that there's a majority on City Council that will say, we are not going to even consider this until we are back on some semblance of normal footing. They don't just need to kick the can down the road, they need to squash the can. And I know I'd love to kill it permanently. That ain't going to happen. What I would say is, let's have this discussion once we're back at full strength, more or less, economically speaking.
Yeah, or even partial strength. And a couple points I want to make. One is that you know you can argue all you want about the federal government response. There were the payroll protection loans that kept people on, and there's also the federal program that provides COVID sick leave for employers to provide to employees. Why is this important? Is because the businesses that you're talking about, many of them are on the verge of bankruptcy. A lot of them have already gone bankrupt, never to operate again. But it's not a question of, again, is this good? Is sick leave in for COVID a good idea? Yeah, it's a good idea. The federal government decided it was, and they put a program in place. Are we going to put another program that's duplicative, that will cost more money for the small businesses that can't operate and are on the verge of bankruptcy? Not real good timing, as you indicated.
Yeah. And keeping with the COVID theme that kind of is dominating, really, it's dominated our lives since March, but it's dominating this week's podcast as we really get beyond the 2020 election. We're not quite ready for the legislative session just yet, but the governor, is saying this is science. We're doing the science. We're making all these decisions based on the science. Now, the New York Times is, I would argue, in many ways, a adjunct of the Democratic Party, and not just the party in general. It's more of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But every once in a while, you find a gem in a New York Times email or some information. They do perform a useful service. Uh, and their email, as we record, so this morning, Monday, uh, and it had a lot of good information about indoor schooling. Now, they were contrasting the United States and its relative efforts to keep restaurants open and shut schools down with European willingness to shut restaurants down and keep schools open. Now, it's not like anybody's been contacting the Rio Grande Foundation, or even if this is President Trump, because President Trump hasn't had a thing to say about it. These are decisions made by America's governors, and in our case, our governor has, PED and the other powers that be. They've given some power to local school districts, but by and large, the encouragement, the policy has been to kind of keep things suppressed, keep
Mm-hmm.
kids home from school. So now we have, I think they're the four largest school districts. It's uh, Albuquerque and Las Cruces have been shut down. They've been only virtual all year. Recently, Santa Fe and Rio Rancho moved to virtual learning as well. So those are definitely four of the biggest school districts in the state of New Mexico, with APS being by far and away the largest. But here I'm reading directly from the New York Times. The one indoor activity that appears to present less risk is school, especially elementary school. Why? Young children seem to spread the virus less often than adults do. Quoting from someone else, research has shown that if you put social distancing protocols in place, school is actually quite a safe environment, says Andreas Sliker, who studies schools for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. Closing schools and switching entirely to remote learning, on the other hand, has big social costs. Still quoting from the New York Times. Children are learning less, and many parents, mostly mothers, have dropped out of the labor force. The U.S. is suffering from both of these problems and from a raging pandemic. So there you go. The New York Times, for once, largely echoing statements of the Rio Grande Foundation in terms of reopening schools.
And to close the loop, and I don't think the New York Times went quite that far, but it's something we've talked about. There's a lot of unintended consequences. If children aren't in school, if children in school most of the day, subject to these social distancing protocols, is it possible, just asking the question, that there actually would be less COVID spread than if you were to have them all at home, unsupervised, running around in their neighborhoods for many hours of their waking days? So, some interesting points. And man, these unintended consequences are really a challenge under any government policy. And when it comes to The COVID-19 pandemic, it seems like you just can't turn around without running smack into it.
Yeah, and it strikes me as extremely odd and interesting that Corey DeAngelis, we've had him on the show. He's an education expert with the Reason Foundation, and he's pointed out numerous times on social media that the union dominance or union power with school districts and states is directly translated into the policy when it comes to COVID-19 and how the reaction is handled. Now, on the kind of related to that, Trump administration had tried to have a portion of the CARES Act, that was the big stimulus bill, passed several months ago, that a portion of that should go to private schools. New Mexico, our attorney general and our governor sued to stop any of that money from going to private schools. Now, notably, also related to that, is that states around New Mexico are providing funding through the CARES Act to families that have impacted by the virus induced shutdowns. Oklahoma is providing $30 million from the CARES Act for those parents to access quality resources they need in order to continue their education journey. So that is according to Governor Stitt in Oklahoma. Idaho's created a $50 million program to for parents and families to spend on eligible education materials, devices, and services. And Texas is using $30 million for special needs students. Excuse me. So there are states, two of whom surround New Mexico, that are coming up with innovative solutions, trying to soften the blow a little bit for families trying to deal with this rapid changing, very frustrating, and definitely not ideal educational situation in our state.
Yeah, and there have been a recent guest on the podcast just talking about all of the challenges and the potential need to for children who are not at the upper end of accomplishment, some sort of program to get them back on track if and when this happens. And I have a feeling it's not going to be just going back to school, because the key is that the effort required to catch somebody up is far in excess of what is necessary to keep them up to speed. And in New Mexico, there are so many kids that have always been reading and performing math and science below grade level to begin with that we're going to have a big problem. I wouldn't mind seeing a special session to talk about that. But, we seem to have them to talk about other things. So,
No doubt about it. And, just kind of as a side note in the whole education discussion, uh, again, and we've said this before, but it's worth reiterating. We have an entire group in Santa Fe, the dominant group, the Democrats, who are going to tap the permanent fund and create an entirely new education system parallel to everything that already exists for pre-K. And yet, here we are with a system that already exists that we're not even hardly utilizing, and certainly not being used to anywhere near the greatest benefit of those students. And we come at this as education reformers to begin with. We're not fans of the government monopoly system for education. Notably, as well, if parents do have the ability and the means to afford a private school, they can and are doing that, and those schools are in person. I've heard very limited reports. Maybe once in a blue moon, you hear of some child at one of these private schools comes down with COVID and they have to take precautions, but they've not had any outbreaks generated within uh, the private schools around New Mexico, so far as I'm aware, when it comes to in person learning. So it's pretty clear that this is a failure of one size fits all bureaucracy and the pressure of the main special interest group, I think, teachers unions. Not this is not about the inability to handle in person schooling in this pandemic. And of course, that's my call, my plea, my frustration with the New York Times is that they seem to think or seem to ascribe the American response to some inherent political thing within the United States, but they won't come out and say, this is the teachers' unions, this is the situation that is in the United States that separates us from Europe, and this is the cause of all this. They kind of just say, oh, it's different philosophies. Americans care more about restaurants than those darn Europeans. And it really has to do with politics in the United States. I don't know what the European political situation is with regard to schools and why they're more willing and able to go back in person, but I can assure you that the number one organization opposing it, my wife's on the PTA. We're embedded in the public school. She's still the head of the PTA at our elementary school that our kids went to. That's interesting by and of itself.
Yes, it is interesting. And yes, I think how you would trade it off is this isn't, oh, look at restaurants compared to public schools. It's look at public schools compared to private schools or American schools compared to European schools. So that really is the question. And restaurants are, that's kind of a red herring that just confuses the argument, regardless of what you think the right or wrong thing to do is with the restaurant industry.
Absolutely, yeah. Even the film industry, which we have numerous issues with, we want them to be able to operate without taxpayer subsidy, of course, but uh, to the extent that each industry could come to the governor, as we talked earlier, and sign a separate deal in order to remain open, that is something that should be encouraged and would be happy. Maybe not encouraged. It's something that, given the alternatives, is far superior to the way things seem to be working out. It's not about one industry or another. It's, are you taking the precautions that you can and operating in a reasonable manner to stop the spread of the virus as best as possible? And if you are doing that, then you should be able to remain open and in business. Now, we've been talking a lot about the New Mexico legislative session, Wally, and how amazingly different and challenging it would be to have a 60-day session in a virtual context. And the House Republicans, nmhousegop.com, you can find this plan. GOP leader Townsend, the public cannot be excluded from the people's house. And basically, the idea that he is proposing would involve postponing the legislative session by and large to the summer of 2020, where the public would be able to engage. Now, I know it's in the Constitution. I know there are all kinds of hurdles to making such a drastic change, but I really don't think you can have, and whether the courts agree or not, I don't think it's reasonable to have a 60-day session in a virtual context. What do you think about the idea of postponing the legislative session till summer, when hopefully, finally, we'll either have a vaccine or we'll have the virus under control to the point where we can have a more or less traditional legislative session?
Well, the starting and ending place for me is yes, that virtually conducted sessions, if the special session that was held is any indication, is a really scary, frightening thing. And so, what do we do? It's in the Constitution. I was thinking about that. Do they just nominally start the session and then just don't do anything and just say, we're just going to let the clock run, keeping it going for the 60 days to comply with the Constitution, then come back in a special session, something like that? Unless you say, oh my goodness, they shouldn't do that. That's not the intent. If you've been up at the legislative session, sometimes they control the calendar and the clock to where it says it's 10 o'clock, but oh no, we're going to do multiple days. So there's definitely precedent for doing things like that. Maybe we could keep them out for a whole decade, Paul. Maybe one delaying for 3 months is not enough. Maybe we should do it a lot longer. depending on what needs to be done from a fiscal point of view, and I have a feeling there's quite a lot, maybe that's not a good idea. But, I guess I would just say for what it's worth, from my perspective, is that if something really, really, really needs doing, one or two things with regard to the budget or fiscal matters. Hopefully, not increasing taxes or putting a lot of new regulations on people to kill businesses when they're dying. Yeah, wait till the summer. That seems like a reasonable approach. I think it's better than the under the cloak of darkness and Zoom meetings that people can't gain access to. I think it'd be far superior.
Yeah, I'll read a quick quote from Minority Leader Townsend, and yeah, he doesn't have much say so in Santa Fe, but I think it is wise for
He has
them
a
to.
lot of say, but not a lot of so, Paul.
It is wise for the Republicans and anyone concerned about where things are going in terms of this upcoming 60-day session to weigh in and have creative ideas. But he says, Townsend says, there is already too much skepticism of the legislative process. Proceeding under the current circumstances would likely be done with little or no public input and exacerbate the distrust in this institution. Our work must be done with full transparency. Anything less would be an insult to the people we represent. Delaying the session is the only way to maintain the safety of the community while ensuring full public participation in the process. And
So I hadn't
yeah.
read that. So I guess Representative Townsend is not that far removed from what I was saying. I think there may be some merit of that. Now, have you heard from the Legislative Finance Committee or how the budget's doing or anything? Is that going to be feasible? Or are we delaying emergency action that needs to be done from a fiscal point of view? What are your
Well, that I haven't heard that. There's obviously been a lot of action taken on the budget already, and we're just going to, I'm sure, find out more as the end of the year goes on, and we'll know what the numbers are looking like in mid January. I'm sure we'll have a really good idea of where things are. Uh, Speaking of Santa Fe and our good friends, the Voices for Children, who we love to just take different sides from them because, well, they are pretty much exclusively on the far left.
all of their children are liberal children?
Very, I don't use the term socialism lightly, but they are very much towards the cutting edge. And unfortunately, they're going to have some pretty sympathetic voices up there in Santa Fe. In the newspaper today, we again have a call. This is Voices for Children, James Jimenez and Oriana Sandoval. James is at the Voices for Children. Oriana Sandoval is at the Center for Civic Policy. And they are saying it's time New Mexico diversified from oil and gas. And we've heard discussion items like this before. We had Jerry Ortiz Pino, state senator, very much in the camp of Voices for Children. Uh, Back, I don't know, May, June, wrote an Albuquerque Journal, same thing. They they are more than happy to talk about the shortcomings of oil and gas from a volatility perspective, how we can't rely on the revenue, how this, that, and the other. But when it comes to what we actually do realistically to diversify our economy, what policies do we enact? What changes do we make? What spending cuts do we need to do? The specifics are vanishingly few. And I say that with regard to both Ortiz Pino as well as our friends at Voices for Children. It just seems like they have these grand schemes
I
of
would call them platitudes. Yeah,
platitudes.
I mean,
Yes.
it's because it is. Okay, so diversify away from oil and gas. What does that mean? Because if that's all you say, that's a platitude. And it doesn't seem like they ever get beyond it. So it's like, do you mean grow other sectors of our private economy and encourage that? And what are the policies? They never even make it that far.
No. And if they or anybody else came along and said, "Here, we have a specific game plan for making New Mexico more robust, more diverse in our economy. So we're not quite as reliant on oil and gas. It that was where we took things on. I would be fine with that kind of conversation, and we would be gladly active participants. But they seem to take the cart before the horse, which involves simply trying to shut down the oil and gas industry. As I think we're seeing this. This is the far left rumblings. We've seen the legislation on no fracking and Santa Fe and the state Senate. Uh, these people may or may not be quite in a position to push this agenda forward, but we're not far from the point where the progressive left in New Mexico has enough pull to actually really take a bite out of the oil and gas industry. And that is one of the most interesting things this session. It's also going to be one of the most troubling things because if they're all meeting behind closed doors with very little public input, that could be a real problem. But yeah, it just, no matter who's proposing the policy, certainly the Rio Grande Foundation, if we have proposal X, we're going to talk about how specifically we get there, not just, yeah, we should get rid of oil and gas and replace it with whatever we can find whenever we do that.
Yeah, I mean, it just, an example would be like me saying, Paul, what we need is 200,000 high paying, high tech jobs in 5 years. It's like,
Great idea.
it's a great idea. Who would argue with that?
Yeah.
But what does that really mean? And some of the things we've seen, the Energy Transition Act comes to mind, where we're going to be carbon free by such and such a year. Okay, that's good. But a lot of the stepping stones from point A to point B, it's like a hopscotch board that only has 1 and 10, and there's like a 50-yard gap between the two. It's like it doesn't sound bad. My statements probably sounds as good to me as theirs sounded to them, and neither one of us have any steps or actionable plans to help encourage that to happen.
Yeah, and just to be clear, this rhetoric has not just been limited to the Jerry Ortiz Epinos and the Voices for Children's of the world. Our governor at a webinar with some climate change advocates and the governors of other states, she echoed the Joe Biden line of transitioning away from oil and gas. That's kind of a polite way of saying, imagine if you're dating somebody, Wally. Take it back to the Wayback Machine. I'm going to transition away from dating you.
Yeah, I'm not breaking up with you. That's such an ugly way to put it, Paul. So.
Yeah, I'm going to transition away from this relationship. I think that seems like a fabulous way of stating things. And yeah, this is something that we are definitely going to be engaged with, active on, and really, if the national economy, if the state economy were on absolutely firm footing and things were going really well for all concerned, I could at least see these people coming up with a path, whether I agree with it or not, and I wouldn't, to doing something to diversify the economy away from oil and gas if they wanted to. But given the current situation, yes, oil and gas are down, but they're still one of, if not the most important industries in the state of New Mexico, especially when it comes to funding government. Certainly, there's a lot of other industries in this state, but none of them kick off quite as much government revenue as does oil and gas. And it's the conundrum that never stops because the liberals love that money flowing into the state. They are dedicated to all those government programs. They want more, more, more. But when it comes to the industry that funds 40% of the state government, they really, really don't like it. And that is damn it, there's a term for that. And it's it's a conundrum,
Yeah.
but it's also another thing. And I just can't remember it right now.
Well, yeah. And the question is, depending on what you put the number is, what 40% of state spending do you think we ought to get rid of? Because that's what we're facing right now. Say, okay, let's get rid of oil and gas. Fine. And I does that mean we get rid of the permanent funds, which are blood money from oil and gas? I hope that isn't the case because they want to spend those too. But yeah, we'll see. It's a very interesting, uh, in your words, conundrum. I think so. But this is one of those that once we get past it's like what happens after the platitudes. So we'll have to see what happens because New Mexico, uh, between COVID and the oil and gas industry being down is facing a lot of headwinds as it is. And if we at some point were to get a fracking ban in our state, it would be very interesting to see what would happen.
The word I was looking for was paradox.
If you had paradox, you are a winner. I agree.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there this week. Wally, thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.